Legends collectors. No money, no space, no willpower. Don't worry, I'm also talking about myself here because I just could not resist the final piece of the ever-growing, or at least seemingly ever-growing puzzle of Marvel Legends completing the No Way Home collection. And finally, we got our last addition to that entire set. One that generally does make me feel complete, despite the variances in quality that I've remarked about constant amount of times here on the channel, from the trilogy of Spider-Men in the form of Tobey, Tom, and Andrew, to even some offshoots that I legitimately never considered to come to the Marvel Legends series from No Way Home, specifically MJ, and even to an extent Matt Murdock, because frankly he was in the cameo scene, so I didn't really fully expect for Marvel Legends to put out one, despite, like I said, the variances in quality with them in terms of likeness, etc. But Sandman was kind of a given, having deluxe editions of some really elaborate takes on villainous characters from the past, like Green Goblin and Doc Ock. Those were must-haves. And sprinkled somewhere in there were going to be some wild cards as far as Electro finally getting a figure, and we were all kind of speculating as to whether or not that was going to come to pass. And amongst them was also the heavily teased Lizard from Amazing Spider-Man. And he did manage to get himself a bit of a release. I say a bit because he did come with a caveat in the form of an Amazon exclusivity, so that's frankly right now, as of right now, the only legitimate way to pick this guy up, because I feel like now with the economy fluctuating and the whole tariff situation, I feel like the term exclusivity is starting to lose a little bit of its splendor, not just within the action figure community, but frankly even the gaming community, other parts, other things that have to do with like nerd culture. I feel like so many things that we thought were set in stone are no longer the case. But digressing from that point, here we have what is still titled as a deluxe edition figure based on the Kurt Connors / Lizard from the Amazing Spider-Man movie, specifically just the first Amazing Spider-Man, that then managed to appear in No Way Home, albeit with, again, his own form of caveat in the form of simply just being Marvel's Lizard, as the box entails, because they obviously don't want to confuse it with any other character also named Lizard, but also to make sure that we're not stepping on any kind of legal toes with Sony, because this is in fact from the Amazing Spider-Man. This is the same situation we had going on when Andrew got his re-release with the No Way Home figures, but he had to have the Amazing Spider-Man 2 branding on the box. That still kind of irks me because it triggers my OCD. Thankfully, we didn't really have to deal with too much of that as far as the branding and as far as the likeness for this Lizard here. And this is especially one that I had my eye on because when it comes to Marvel Legends just as a whole, when they're dealing with very CG or creature-heavy designs for certain characters, they managed to hit it out of the park. To this day, I still think that despite the god-awfulness of the show, I think that the She-Hulk figure that they put out from the MCU line is actually one of their much more refined and better looking figures. And obviously, they don't really have to worry about, catering to certain actors' likeness. That's probably one of the breaths of fresh air or sighs of relief that the Marvel Legends team probably were able to take when they realized that when No Way Home came out, Lizard was predominantly going to be CG, and whenever, spoilers, he gets reverted back to Kurt Connors, they simply just recycled footage from Amazing Spider-Man. So they didn't have to worry about any of those loopholes, and therefore, in my opinion, they were able to deliver on a pretty solid Lizard figure here because he stands to scale within the 6-inch scaling or 6-inch line. Therefore, he is able to kind of live up a little bit to that deluxe title in the form of being just a little taller, a little girthier, and a bit more solid, and give it a little bit of that extra sense, that extra monstrous presence to the figure itself. And one of those elements presented just right out of the box is the tail back here, because you actually have to do a little bit of assembly to fit the tail onto the little stump from coming out of his literal ass slit, which was very unconventional. I never noticed the Marvel Legends being able to do something like this, but good to see that the guys over at Hasbro were able to slightly experiment a little bit with the way that this whole thing's kind of tooled together, and obviously it also makes things a bit more convenient to fit them into the packaging. So once you kind of pull out the tail and fit it in here, very accurate to lizard anatomy, because an awful lot of lizards are able to grow their tails back and end up with a little bit of a bony stump there. So again, even if you disassemble this guy, he's still technically lore accurate. It is a bit more difficult to remove because of the way that this stub is designed, so it's meant to kind of hold the tail very firmly in place, But when you do that, there you go, completes the entirety of the image. And if anything, it also kind of is able to serve as a form of counterweight to the rest of the figure, because when I say that they built this lizard pretty heavily and pretty accurately to the way that he's portrayed on screen, they actually managed to do that. First and foremost, the color scheming is pretty on point. They did a pretty effective job as far as the paint applications, making sure that the skin is pretty scaled well as far as the little indentations, the reptilian kind of pattern that is pretty accurate, but also they made sure to have it fit in a way that makes accurate to the anatomy that the lizard had going on. For example, the shoulders, the biceps, and even a little bit of the forearms, you'll notice that some of the scales are kind of, for lack of a better term, I'm sorry, I don't mean the pun here, but they're scaled down to make sure that they're proportionate to the skin that is on said body parts. So they're naturally going to be a bit smaller on areas like the forearms, the wrists, the hands, the feet, but then get a little bit more blown out when it comes to like the thicker thighs, the biceps, the shoulders, exceptionally around the neck area that's a little bit more elongated and protruding. So I really do appreciate the level of detail as far as applying the green around the predominant part of the limbs, but then kind of approaching this kind of gradient level to the way that the green then transforms into yellow for the middle part of his abdominal muscles, the chest pieces right here, as well as the inside part of the legs. And it flows really well. I really do like the way that the paint applications are incorporated here, the little bit of shading with the gill-like attributes to the obliques, the abdominal areas, like I said before, and it all feels like it's legitimate lizard skin that you could almost kind of peel off and kind of stretch. Very, like I said, very accurate to not only the biology of a lizard, but also the way he looked like on screen. On top of that, the actual solid build of the legs, the musculature, this legit does not feel like a cheap figure. This guy retails for $35 on average. And so I know that was a point of contention when it came to the Electro figure for $40. In fact, it was a point of contention for me that I thought to myself, it was still a pretty good figure that I had a pretty fun experience playing around with, messing around and kind of posing him with the Andrew Spider-Man and putting him next to some of the other villain characters, etc. But I still stand with my opinion on that figure not necessarily living up to that $40 price tag. I'll go as far as to say that the solid build of this lizard figure, the scaling, as well as, like I said, giving it that presence, not only with the musculature happening within the torso piece, the legs, the arms, and even a little bit of the attention to the claws on both the toes and the fingers, and then, like I said, kind of giving it a sense of volume and balance with the tail here towards the back. All of this for $35 is in fact kind of justifying it just a tad bit. And unlike Electro, which had to bear the cross that was movie likeness to that of Jamie Foxx, which frankly I feel was probably kind of dealing with its own issues behind the scenes, therefore they had to put the electric shock mask, which again, in the long run, I do kind of prefer over just a very generic Jamie Foxx head on that sculpt for that figure. They managed to here hit a damn near home run as far as the likeness to the CG lizard, because after all, it is a CG character. So as far as the ink jetting and the sculpting happening behind the likeness on the head itself is actually pretty top notch. I really do dig the way that this guy came across as far as the little indentations, the little rivets he's got going on here on the forehead, as well as, of course, the very, for lack of a better term, Koopa-like approach to the way that they design lizard here. It may not float everybody's boat. Even I was kind of resistant to his design when the Amazing Spider-Man came out back in 2012, but over time I kind of warmed up to it a little bit. And here I feel like this is pretty much a one-to-one representation in 1/12 format or 6-inch format, even though, like I said, he's a little bit on the taller side. And again, everything as far as being able to nail the balancing, even when it came down to areas that I had my fears with, as far as the way that these legs are designed to mimic that of the lizard anatomy with the protruding ankles here towards the back and seeing how tiny his feet really were, only to then realize just how much of a third appendage or stabilizer the tail ended up being, which in and of itself is also somewhat articulated. I say somewhat because when you apply the tail here after its assembly right out of the box, you'll notice that you can technically slide it up and down on the little ass slit, as I mentioned before, but unfortunately no kind of horizontal movement. It can only move up and down and technically rotate in place where you plug it in. I do kind of wish that there was a way to nudge it from side to side to again kind of favor a little bit of that lizard motif, and it is a little bendy towards the tail end of the tail over here, but unfortunately no kind of like wiring or posability built within the tail in and of itself. It just kind of reverts back to this kind of coiled standing up state. So you're gonna have to deal a little bit with the rigidness of the tail in and of itself, but I do like that. Again, if you are happening across some issues with the posability, you can kind of sort of rely on the tail of itself to prop it up like this. And since we're talking about posability and movement, let's tackle the articulation, which is a little unconventional, but frankly, this is a very unconventional figure, so I kind of respect it. The head is able to turn 360 on a ball joint and is able to tilt up and down pretty decently and side to side ever so slightly, like you can kind of see right about right there, which fits the bill for the character. But then when you move down, they kind of design this very strange neck piece in this kind of like a swivel, or like a, I don't know how to describe it. It kind of feels a bit dumbbellish inside, but you can note right there that this cone design to the neck piece is then able to kind of unpeg itself. It feels like it pegs into like a slot, and then when you press it a little bit, you're able to nudge the neck piece a little higher, as you can kind of see right there, and it even gives you a bit of a glance at a slit at the top of the shoulders right underneath right there. So you can take this whole thing and just kind of shove it upwards to give him a little bit of extension towards the top side right there, if you ever want to do that. And technically, it can also rotate, except you are going to be dealing with a slight bit of resistance due to the way that this neck piece is designed with that cone design in mind. So you just be careful a little bit, and it really can't shove side to side because of the way that, like I said, the slit inside is just not going to allow that. So just keep that in mind, but still, it's pretty peculiar that they opted for something like this for the lizard, but out of all the characters, the lizard is the one to have it coincide with. Unfortunately, no form of butterfly movement or joints found here in the shoulders, but nevertheless, you can move the shoulders and rotate them vertically 360 degrees on a slightly ratcheted joint there. It's a little on the softer side, but the hinge inside could also allow you to extend the arms almost beyond the 180 degree angle, as you can kind of see right about right there. The biceps are able to rotate the full 360, as well as the two pinless elbow joints are able to flex the arm almost all the way up like so, and then the hands can fully rotate 360 in place on the cuff, as well as the hinge baked inside of the hand is able to move the hand up and down. Only one torso joint that allows the full 360 movement all the way around like so, and can slightly crunch, actually can really crunch pretty well inwards, as you can kind of see it right about right there, but extension towards the back is a little on the limited side, only because of the way that the back is sort of sculpted here. Great detail and musculature happening there, but unfortunately it just kind of comes into conflict with the bottom piece that doesn't allow supreme amount of extension towards the back side there, but can definitely crunch on the obliques side to side, as you see before you right there. Unfortunately, no waist articulation of any kind found here on the cod piece, but right on the sides here, you can note that the legs can extend upwards about that far, right about right there, and only about that much towards the back before it comes into conflict with, again, the ass piece right back there. An extension towards the sides because of the way that the bulkiness of the top legs are sculpted. It can extend pretty modestly, as you can kind of see right about right there, but it just comes shy of the full 180 degree angle. Right underneath that though, you do have thigh swivels that can rotate all the way around, two knee joints that can fully bend all the way up and are also pinless. But then you get another one of those quirky designs saved for the lizard here, because the feet articulation, obviously because he's got much untraditionally designed ankles, which are a little higher above here and almost constitute as shin swivels, they weren't going to be able to bake into that as far as that traditional Marvel Legends hinge joint for the ankles. So they moved it a little lower to the point where it's almost toe articulation, but it's technically also just the feet articulation that you can only find on a character like Lizard here that can still bend the bottom half of his foot up and extend it upwards like so, and naturally, just like those ankle joints that you find on traditional Marvel Legends, can kind of pivot the foot inwards and outwards, but technically speaking can rotate at the full 360 in that angle. It just won't be able to do it horizontally. But considering that this is a reptilian creature, it's not the big, if anything, it's able to kind of mask itself and not be a detriment. Because if this was just a humanoid character like Spider-Man, Electro, Doc Ock, having a design like that has always been a bit of an issue for me with Marvel Legends, but to find it in a very unorthodox character like Lizard and to have that anatomy be changed up, strangely, it sort of fits. What also fits is that this is going to be the Lizard, therefore he's not necessarily going to come with an awful lot of accessories, considering that in No Way Home, he didn't really have any. He didn't come with any secondaries. Like, if anything, maybe he was kind of flipping the antidote to the cure back to back in between Spideys when he was fighting them. But that's not going to be necessarily the case here, which only makes me wish that there was a way. And who knows, there's probably no way to truly rule this out, but maybe later down the line, Marvel Legends will then kind of reignite some negotiations with Sony and deliver on a Amazing Spider-Man version of this particular release, in which maybe you can incorporate some kind of like lab coat, like a torn up lab coat that you can kind of fit onto him, whether it be plastic or even better, felt goods. That would be sick. Maybe, come up with like that thing that he was carrying at the end of Amazing Spider-Man towards the top of the tower, etc. That would be awesome. But for the time being, this is the No Way Home version, and therefore we're only going to be dealing with pretty much the bare minimum as far as an extra pair of hand accessories that you can swap out. Naturally, he comes with a fisted hand on the right, so on the side here, you do have an extended clawed up hand for the right, and then a much more stretched out clawed up hand for the left, as opposed to the curled up kind of devilishly, evil looking left hand that he's got going on right there. That also mimics that of the way that he kind of cuts Peter's chest in Amazing Spider-Man. Though to give them a few points for accuracy, I do appreciate the fact that they managed to still pay attention to having only 4 fingers on the right hand versus the left hand. The left hand has 5 fingers, only 4 for the right, and that also gets applied to the fisted hand over there. If you look carefully, he's only got 4 fingers on the fisted hand, and at first I thought it was a goof. I will admit, I thought to myself, like, why is this happening? And then as I went back and watched some scenes, I realized that, oh yeah, in this incarnation of Kurt Connors / the Lizard, he's missing his right arm. That's the one that he reconstructs, and therefore he's only got the 4 fingers because he's mixing it with reptilian DNA. And that's the appendage that is therefore more reptilian than the other. So therefore that's why he's only got 5 over here and 4 over here. So that I thought that was actually a cool thing that they still respected in Marvel Legends format, so that's pretty awesome. And similarly, they also respected the aggressive look that he's got going on with a screaming head sculpt right here, which you can swap out for the default one over here. This is technically the one that he comes with default right out of the box, but for posterity, I swapped it out for the neutral one to kind of showcase a few more details of the likeness and the good pan applications. So you get a little bit of an extension of that with the screaming open mouth head sculpt here with a much more aggressive look. The tongue, the little, stretching of the dislocated jaw right there, again catering to the reptilian nature, and I do like the teeth in there. So pretty nice that you can kind of swap that out and you got yourself some options. Again, there's a tiny little part of me that wishes that he would have come with an extra little thing, but at the same time, it wouldn't have been all that terribly screen accurate for the No Way Home version. So I guess the only thing left to sort of desire would have been maybe like a fisted hand for the left. But Marvel Legends, they're going to Marvel Legends, and that's ultimately what they've always done with, whether it be the traditional Spider-Man figures, as far as like the No Way Home stuff, the MCU stuff, or even some of the comic stuff, where you're always going to be dealing with some kind of asymmetrical bullshit as far as those hand accessories, or even with some of their villains. I'm able to let it slide a little bit more here because at least making up for that would have to be the solid build to the figure itself, the inclusion of the tail that gives it an added level of presence, the detail behind, like I said, the scaling, the paint applications, and overall just a well-tooled, well-articulated figure that is at least able to sweeten up the deal a little bit by cutting $5 off the price from what originally stung with that Electro figure. And it almost makes me feel kind of bad that he's stuck as being an Amazon exclusive, because as opposed to Electro, who inadvertently is also a Target exclusive, I feel like this guy probably deserved some more eyes on him on the toy shelves in brick and mortar stores versus the former. And therefore, I feel much more adequate to give the Marvel's Lizard from No Way Home a pretty solid 8 out of 10. It's one that I think is more worthy of being a deluxe as opposed to some of the other incarnations. However, he's still not able to touch the actual solid releases of the Green Goblin figure and the Doc Ock figure. Which, speaking of those folks, guys, it is time. Let's bring in the whole family in here. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I gotta be honest, the majority of the entire No Way Home collection from Marvel Legends, at least the contemporary Marvel Legends. I feel like I can more or less rest easy. I know that some of you are probably still gonna hold me to task of picking up that integrated suit Spidey, but knowing that he's almost the same exact buck as far as the final suit figure, only with a bit of a color and slight sculpting of the spider suit swap there on the chest and on the back. Honestly, there's a part of me that's like, I feel like I'm already kind of good, and then Doctor Strange is simply just a repackage of like the previous Doctor Strange that was released. It's like, I don't know. Maybe I'll scavenge them across, but so far, as far as having at least one solid release per character from No Way Home, this is the vast majority of it, and for the time being, I'm pretty happy with it. And though we did have some variousness in quality as far as like that Toby Buck or the licensing stuff happening with Andrew and everything kind of in between, ending it with the high note, or somewhat high note, of the Lizard's release here, and seeing this grand assembly before my eyes, I'm pretty happy with it. I'm pretty satisfied with what I was able to achieve. So if any of you managed to get your Marvel's Lizard delivered, did it finally complete your No Way Home Marvel Legends collection? Are you guys satisfied with it, or are you missing a couple of entries in there? Or do you feel like you just needed to get the bare essentials as far as the Spideys, maybe Matt Murdock, and just get right out of there dodge quick? And while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, take care and stay humble.